Welcome. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to another No Small Talk Sunday. Um, uh, Recently, um, I've had a chance to reflect on some of the amazing and miraculous things that have happened to me in my life. It's always a difficult thing for me to come to terms with some of the discoveries that I've made that have been the result of a series of serendipitous synchronicities that the universe has supplied. I recognize my part in that by the decisions that I've made, that I went this way instead of this way, that I decided to go to chiropractic school, but I almost talked myself out of it, so the universe burned my house down and gave me enough money to go, and I could travel light. Other decisions put me in a certain place at a certain time where I could meet someone that I needed to meet. The universe has a way of synchronizing events in a way that you meet the right person and the lights turn green and the right doors open for you. But you are responsible for learning how to look for the doors when they're opening and walk through them. So while we all have the right to be proud of those decisions, of exercising the muscle of our consciousness to be able to become more adept at seeing and looking for when the doors are closing and when the doors are opening, and to have the ability and the sort of chutzpah to walk through that door when it's opening. As you exercise that muscle more and more, it becomes easier to see immediately when the doors are closing and when the other ones are opening, so that you don't have to keep banging your head against closed doors before you finally get the message after you've injured yourself so much. When I graduated from chiropractic school and ended up with the largest holistic health center in Virginia, another weirdo thing that happened to me. In the midst of creating the sound work and experimenting in that clinic for 9 years, and realizing that the sound work was way more powerful than everything else I was doing, and we were doing everything by definition, all the holistic therapies we could pack under one roof. That inspired me to realize that I could actually follow this path and do it full time and develop it, the sound path, if I was willing to cash in my chips as a very successful young doctor with the biggest clinic in Virginia. And so making the decision to sell that all and to take a bundle of cash and drive to California and set up a big center there was sort of madness, courage, mixed in with a little bit of naivete, because I couldn't really appreciate what such a gigantic move could mean if it failed. I consoled myself that if it all fails and I end up in the gutter, at least it's a warm gutter because I'm in San Diego. But that set me up to get a lot of press and become pretty famous, and came to the notoriety of a company in Holland who sent me a EEG machine to test out, the first EEG machine in the world that could plug into a home computer. And because of that, I was able to discover a new brainwave frequency, Epsilon, below delta. And later I was to find out the reason that nobody had discovered that before was because the professional level EEG machines that are dedicated to neurofeedback and the rest of that have blinders on, that you can't see below 1 hertz or above 35. So even if you have below 0.5 hertz delta, where epsilon is, you wouldn't be able to see it because you've got blinders on your computer. And since I had this new machine that was sent to me had no blinders on it. Another serendipitous discovery, and now I'm recognized in the EEG world as the person who discovered epsilon brainwave activity. And it was unknown to me until I realized recently, by meeting a top EEG researcher through my contact with Tony Robbins, that he was sort of bragging that, yes, I've done a lot of extensive research on my EEG with Epsilon. I use it all the time. And he was excited to meet the person who discovered it. And that was kind of a funny experience for me because, you know, my question was, how are you able to see Epsilon with your EEG machine? He said, well, I make my own. So it's like, okay, I get it. I also discovered that I'm credited with putting forth the idea of the borderline brain states as brain states of their own, which once again expands the repertoire of brain waves in the nomenclature. You know, I mean, for years, and still in most EEG circles, they only recognize the big four: beta, alpha, theta, and delta. More and more and more are recognizing gamma. And now it appears that in some circles they're recognizing epsilon, and more EEG circles are talking about the frequencies above gamma, hypergamma, and lambda, and referencing them as hypergamma and lambda. And I named those because I was the only researcher dealing with them for years. And so at present, we recognize 22 different brainwave states that we use clinically, that I've used in my practice for years and years, for 40 years. And now we use it in these centers like the Sky Lounge Center, in the biotuning program. But I recognize already that there are more than that. There are more brain frequencies than just the borderline states. There are frequencies that are non-borderline combinations of brain frequencies. For instance, gamma interfaces with theta, and those aren't borderlines to each other, which potentially raises the stakes to hundreds of brainwave frequency combinations. And as we're going to see today, because today we're talking about brainwaves, and this concept of the 22 brainwave states that we deal with in a clinical fashion, in a methodical step-by-step, bringing you through each one of these brain states and turning that program on and running it until it's clean, has profound effects on your health and your consciousness and your ability to access your inborn talents and maximize those, and ultimately to reach into your consciousness itself and expand your consciousness in a new high-tech method of the science of meditation. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. I have talked about in all these past live streams all the way back 3-4 years ago, back to 2020, when I first started these broadcasts. I've continually referenced the fact that there are all of these different brain states and the borderline states and SMR beta and mu and all the rest of them. But I've never made a coherent broadcast that goes through these 21 magic programs in the brain that each specifically accesses a different state of consciousness as a coherent whole. And that's what today is going to be like, pulling all those strings together. The 22 different neural codes for unlocking different states of consciousness that have all specific purposes. And if we can maximize all of them, we become a new whole person in a way that has never really been possible before in humanity. So strap on your seatbelts, because here we go. As we explore a deeper level of the concept of what brainwaves and specific states of consciousness represent. This amazing, as I've said before, 3 pounds of semi-gelatinous hardware, essentially a quantum computer and beyond. As we're going to see, it's not just one quantum computer, it's at least 6 quantum computers, and magnified beyond that, as we'll explain a bit. This electro-magnetic, gelatinous, organic object, that's the most mind-boggling thing that we've so far discovered in the universe, more complex than anything we've ever seen, that has the ability of self-awareness to contemplate its own existence and beyond. It's just mind-boggling and amazing. The architecture of the brain and how it mimics the architecture that we see in astrophysics, of the arrangement of galactic nebulas and galaxies and all the rest along roadways and highways in the heavens, that reflect almost exactly in how the brain architecture is put together in the connectome, and how that means that the brain and the universe are linked together as octave harmonic relationships that resonate together the same way we see in music theory, where you sing the right note and the wine glass vibrates, and you sing any octave or harmonic of that note and the wine glass vibrates. In this case, the wine glass can be your brain, or the wine glass can be the universe at large. The frequency of you is what sets it all up. And to come in alignment and strengthen the resonance of you to your quantum core accesses the grandest zone of the universe itself and links them together through a sort of new form of brainwave entrainment of the quantum mind and the universal mind, with us standing dead center right in the middle, right here. You know, I went to school, and it's still true today. The brain is made of a layer on the outside called gray matter, where the neurons are that generate electrical signals and brain waves. And the white matter are cables that carry information between brain waves and down the brainstem into the spinal cord and out into the body. So, you know, 40% of the brain that is gray matter contains most of the brain's neuronal cell bodies. It's fully developed by the time you reach your 20s. Usually 24 is the growth phase end in a bell curve. And it conducts processes and sends information to various parts of the body. The cable network exchanges information. The white matter, made up of bundles which connect various matter areas, develops through the 20s and peaks in middle age, and interprets sensory information and sends information back down to the body to make your muscles work. We were taught that these neurons up here firing together in brainwave sequences is what it's all about. And as time has gone on, and I've referenced in previous live streams, it turns out that the gray matter itself is heavily participating in what the gray matter does or does not do. That the gray matter itself, the white matter itself, is not just cables. That there are cell bodies there like astrocytes who wrap around the neurons and actively participate in whether the neuron is going to summate its electrical discharge or not. So there are layers and layers and layers of control systems in the white matter that we never knew of before. That thinking and consciousness is not just the domain of the gray matter, gray cells, the neurons in the gray matter, which expands the whole idea of brainwaves and when they fire and why they fire and who controls how they and why they fire, and consciousness itself. These neurons and the axons and the gray matter matrix that connects to the axons and connects to the gray matter is all part of the whole mix. It's not just, telephone cables going to different places. They are participating in the decisions that are made in the gray matter. And the connectivity of the gray matter cells, the neurons in your brain, every neuron in your brain has got axon connections to other neurons. Up to this point, we can tell that each neuron has approximately 10,000 connections to 10,000 other neurons. You multiply that, it quickly becomes trillions of connections because there's 800 billion neurons. But as we were to discover when Einstein's brain, after Einstein died, the neuroanatomist who is in charge of his body stole his brain, sawed the top of his head open and stole Einstein's brain and put it in a glass container with formalin to preserve it and carried it around in the trunk of his car and drove his car around the country to different labs and different research centers and shared microtome slices of his brain to all kinds of people to research, is there something different about Einstein's brain than any of the rest of us? And what did he discover, or what did they all discover? That yes, there's something very different about Einstein's brain. It's 35% heavier and 35% denser than ordinary brains. And the denseness and the heaviness is not more brain cells, it's more axon connections between brain cells. So instead of 10,000 connections, it's, 50,000 connections per neuron. It's like an array. It's like the dish array in New Mexico, where you've got 27 dishes pointed towards the sky that all move in synchrony with each other and forms the biggest dish on Earth, because it's an array and they're all functioning as one. And that's essentially how the brain works. It's an array of neurons with hyperconnectivity between them, and the more connectivity, the higher your IQ, the more processing power your brain has to carry out more types of computations parallel to each other because there's so many connections. And these neurons fire in synchrony with each other according to the law of coupled oscillators, the same law that governs sympathetic resonance. So the brain waves are causing other brain waves to fire in synchrony in waves of depolarization that spread across the cortex at different speeds. And for some reason, the speed of these depolarizations is directly related to different states of consciousness. And so we categorize those waves of depolarization as beta, alpha, theta, delta, epsilon, gamma, and all the rest. Why the speed of these conglomerations of neurons all acting together in synchrony, according to the law of coupled oscillators, and why that has to do with specific states of consciousness itself is still a mystery. But at least the bottom line, the rhythmic nature of these depolarizations and the relationship between wave to wave are also according to the laws of music theory, harmonics and overtones, and now we see different areas of the cortex of waves linking together at distances from each other and resonating together at different distances from each other, specifically according to the law of harmonics and overtones, sympathetic resonance. And so that means that the laws of music theory and octaves and harmonics are deeply associated with different states of consciousness. This concept that this structure and the electrical depolarizations in waves of depolarization according to music theory is deeply associated with consciousness itself is one of the grand poetic mysteries of the universe. MIT News. A study reveals a universal pattern of brainwave frequencies. Across mammalian species, brainwaves are slower in deep cortical layers, while superficial layers generate faster rhythms. MIT neuroscientists found that the 6 anatomical layers of the mammalian brain cortex show distinct patterns of electrical activity, which are consistent throughout the entire cortex and across several animal species, including humans. What are they talking about there? I've mentioned this before. There are 6 layers of of neurons in the gray matter of the brain. So the gray matter is out here, the white matter is in here, and this gray matter has 6 layers of neurons that are all axon connected to each other across a layer and between layers. So all of a sudden the brain of whatever you, however magnificent and mind-blowing that you thought the brain was before, it now turns out that there are at least 6 brains more than what we thought. Because up to this point, we were just looking at the gray matter as having a layer of neurons. And now we realize that there's 6 layers of neurons, and they're all interacting with each other and connected to each other on one layer. But they're also connected to other layers at different kinds of relationships. It's got connections with layers 5 and layer 1 and layer 2 and layer 3. It's unimaginably more complex than we had ever realized before. And what this article is saying is that that these 6 layers of activity are each of those 6 layers is generating different kinds of brainwave depolarizations. That this concept of the slow wave brain activity, like down in delta, and the fast wave brain activity up in gamma at 40 hertz, down in delta is at like 1 hertz or 0.5 hertz, that they are layer specific. So now we've got these 6 layers, and way down at the bottom are the slow delta waves. The theta waves are up in the middle someplace, and the gamma waves are way up at the top. And those are all interacting with each other. And one way that they interact is these borderline states that I've proposed. And worked with those clinically for 40 years. So there are definite things that happen. I mean, you can experience the difference of what happens in a certain brain state. Like the flow state is a borderline brain state between alpha and theta. And so is the Schumann resonance. It's so unimaginably more complex than we had ever given it credit for. Whatever we thought the brain was, is at least 6 times more powerful than that. And when you factor in the fact that the white matter that used to be thought of as cables carrying information is also actively engaged along with the gray matter neurons in making decisions about whether the neurons fire or how rapidly they fire, then it's even more mind-boggling than we thought from that standpoint. I've included this because this is the most expanded list of brainwaves from a website that I've seen so far. 50% of what's out there is still only recognizing beta, alpha, theta, delta, the big four. The concept of dividing beta into 3 categories, now that's been around for a while. It's been around for at least 15 years. The idea that low beta and mid beta and high beta are also different states of consciousness of their own. But the waveform is the same waveform. It's just a speed thing that's different. When beta crosses over into alpha, there's actually a different electrical waveform. And when alpha crosses to theta, it's a different electrical waveform, aside from just the speed. But the waveform within beta, low, mid, high, are all beta frequencies. It's not a different frequency. When you cross over into gamma, different frequency. When you go into high gamma, what I call hyper gamma, different frequency. So, as you can see here, when you divide beta into 3 categories, this low beta from around 13 hertz up to about 15, they have 12 to 15, but beta doesn't go to 12. It starts at 13. Relaxed yet focused, integrated reading, drawing, passive listening. Mid beta, aware of self and surroundings, thinking, problem solving, note taking. High beta, alertness, agitation, state of excitement, panic, anxiety, high agitation. It also governs extreme focus. Doesn't have to be anxiety. It's the level of focus where somebody can walk into the room and say your name and try to gain your attention, and you have blocked them out. You're so focused that you don't see, hear anything in your environment. It's disappeared. Gamma at 40 hertz, information processing, perception, new material. Super high frequency gamma, what I'd call hyper gamma, up to 100 hertz. Heightened perception perceived by monks and proficient meditators, like the research done by the Dalai Lama with his monks who had been meditating for 30 years, showed massive amplitudes of gamma. I propose that hyper gamma and the frequency above that at 200 hertz lambda could be associated with extreme states of access of energy from outside of the brain. For instance, when Dalai Lama did the research with gamma and saw high amplitudes of gamma, by definition, the faster the brain frequencies go, the smaller their amplitude. So gamma hadn't been discovered yet with the EEG because its amplitude was too small to penetrate the skull. But the Dalai Lama's monks, their gamma had such a high amplitude, it was able to penetrate the skull and be picked up by regular EEG. And that little fact right there everybody seemed to miss that. To me, it was obvious because I deal with this all the time, this idea that the slower the brainwaves, the larger their amplitude, and the faster the brainwave, the smaller the amplitude, and that's why gamma was never discovered before, or hypergamma or lambda, 100 hertz or 200 hertz. Amplitude is so small that you couldn't penetrate the skull. So the obvious question that nobody was asking is, where's all the energy coming from in order to generate high gamma? And the proposal that I put forward is that gamma opens a doorway to extra physical body energy sources from the universe at large. that allows you to have all the energy you need to create any amplitude of these super high frequencies that you need to, which may be an explanation for at 200 hertz lambda how you could sort of melt the snow around you meditating in the Himalayan mountains. Here's a sort of a complete list that I put together of the different brain states that we have worked with over the decades. In yellow, I'm sorry, in blue is the big four. So it's beta, alpha, theta, and delta, with the addition of gamma. So I'm lumping all these three into one category: beta, alpha, theta, delta. And now at least 50% of the EEG nomenclature and community is including the gamma frequency. The borderline states are in yellow. Beta gamma borderline state is a state of its own. Beta alpha, alpha theta, theta delta, and delta epsilon, which begs the question of, is there a borderline state between gamma and hypergamma, and between hypergamma and lambda? Is there a borderline state between epsilon 1 and 2 and epsilon 2 and default mode network, or a borderline state between these two, or between default mode and iota? Those are all possibilities. If the pattern, once I see a pattern emerging like this, usually nature doesn't have an end to that pattern. It's obeying a deeper structural law that exhibits and expands out. You just haven't discovered it yet. So I'm assuming that there is at least a borderline state between epsilon and default mode network, and default mode network and iota, and perhaps one between these two and these two. So that expands our list from 22 even more. But this has still needs to be researched. I haven't done that research yet. It's on the shelf to be done. But each one of these states has a distinct brainwave pattern and state of consciousness and ability and experience that goes with it. Now, from the standpoint of biotuning, where we are taking this advanced heart rate variability system that's real-time, and which uses EKG leads that collect electrical information, like the EKG leads on your chest for an EKG reading from your heart. That's very different. That's a professional version of heart rate variability versus the layman's version, which is PPG, which is pulse, measuring pulse. A finger clip or a Fitbit or an Oura ring or an ear clip that's measuring once the heart muscle is contracted and squeezed the blood out, and it makes the arteries expand and contract and expand and contract with each heartbeat. That's what this is measuring. So it's much less exact than measuring the electrical event that comes down from the hypothalamus, where the organelle, that's the origin of the vagus nerve, the origin of the parasympathetic nervous system, which controls the autonomic. From that little organelle down, exiting the brainstem is the vagus nerve that goes to the SA node of the heart and causes an electrical sweep of frequencies going across the heart that makes the heart muscle contract. We're measuring the electrical event, not the heart muscle contraction, with the professional version of heart rate variability, which is measuring frequency bandwidths in hertz in resonance fields in the electromagnetic depolarization across the heart, displayed here in this window as very low frequency, as very low frequency, and high frequency bandwidths. And I propose very high frequency bandwidths in this, what I call the gray zone, which is another discussion that we could have in another broadcast, but I have covered this in the past. This has to do with the civilization neuron, with empathy. It's a separate cranial nerve, the ninth cranial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, that has a secondary neuron of control of parasympathetic function. It has nerve branches that connect directly to the vagus nerve back and forth. The two of them form a union with each other. This red zone is the ninth cranial nerve, which wraps around the carotid arteries and messages the brain if the blood pressure is dropping in the head from gravity. So those are all kind of normal responses. So in the HRV, we can see this zone is the ninth cranial nerve and the barometric receptors in the carotid artery, subconscious rumination, and hormones that affect autonomic function. This is the sympathetic this is the sympathetic nervous system, blue. This is the parasympathetic nervous system in green. This is the empathic second control system of the ninth cranial nerve, which is also this one. So the two ends are the ninth cranial nerve, and in the middle is controlled by the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. This window, we're looking for the relationship between these two where they're both off, where I'm not fighting for my life in sympathetic and I'm not digesting my food or eliminating toxins with parasympathetic, that I'm at the 0 point of zero stress in the system, my safe place, which is a prerequisite for being able to heal. Because when you're in this place and neither of these two functions is pulling energy from the reservoir of my system, in this case, the reservoir is full, which allows the internal physician program to engage and work on a series of things on a list that's constantly updating and receiving signals from all my organs and glands and biochemistry and meridians and all the rest, and analyzing those and sending signals back out to harmonize and synchronize all my body systems so I can be healthy. If I'm stuck in a fight or flight response all the time, this is disengaged and I can't heal. And is recognized worldwide in medical circles as the ultimate cause of disease. Stress, the ultimate cause of disease. And if it's stuck, we can hit the reset button and return it to this function with a precisely tuned sound wave. That is biotuning, that I used in a clinical practice for 40 years. However, once you find a frequency that causes this to happen, you now are in the law of music theory and the law of acoustics, the sort of the physics of acoustics. So let's pretend that the frequency that makes this happen, that pushes the reset button, is this frequency, 266.24, or C plus 30 cents on the keyboard, because we can tune between C and C sharp by 100 steps of sharp or flat. So according to the law of octaves, I can take this frequency and divide it in half, and divide that in half, and divide that in half. These are octaves, all the octaves of this frequency. So we'll calculate those out. If I use any of these separate octaves all by itself, then I will also get homeostasis on my screen, because every octave should work according to the law of coupled oscillators. However, at 20 hertz is the lowest borderline of hearing. So these frequencies down here are brain frequencies. They're not sound anymore. They're precise and exact brainwave frequencies, accurate to a couple of decimal points in beta, alpha, theta, delta, and all the rest. This concept is a new idea of a clinical use of brainwave entrainment and binaural beats to a highly specific brain frequency, not something that's just general, something that is unique to your brain, that if we then use binaural beats and brainwave entrainment to entrain you to any one of these brain states, then we cause this homeostasis on the computer screen with the HRV program. That because every octave should make the wine glass vibrate, brainwave octaves should also do the same thing and return this system to zero and engage the internal physician program for turning on the healing program at these different brain states. So now we have a sort of a different idea about what sleep might be. That as my brainwaves in a waking state, in beta, that when I get in bed and I turn the light out and close my eyes, alpha expands and beta collapses immediately. And as my brainwaves slow down from 13 hertz alpha to 12, 11, 10, 9, 8.32. When I hit 8.32 in alpha phase of sleep, it turns on this healing program at an autonomic level, and that's the time at night when I'm healing my mental body, where self-defeating belief systems and stuff like that reside. And then after my brainwaves slow down further and cross over the borderline into theta at around somewhere between 7 and 8 hertz, 7, 6, 5, 4.16 hertz, when as soon as my brain hits this, the brain recognizes this as the combination lock that unlocks the homeostasis healing program for my emotions. This is where emotional healing takes place. Theta is where REM sleep happens, dreaming. Dreams are always emotional. I'm being chased by the boogeyman, and I think it's real. Delta is physical healing. That's where I'm in the deepest stage of sleep, most difficult to wake up, lowest heart rate, respiration, body temperature, metabolic processes in my cells, the deepest I can get, and the most relaxed my physical body can get. That's where physical healing is taking place. The interesting phenomenon that we discovered here, though, is that when you do the math and you calculate all the octaves, you end up with 3 separate delta frequencies, just how the math works out. So that means I had made another discovery, that in delta sleep, there are 3 different places in delta sleep where there are 3 separate programs that each unlock homeostasis in the autonomic nervous system for some different kind of level of healing in the physical body. So the physical body requires 3 separate programs to heal it, where alpha needs 1, theta needs 1, but the physical body needs 3. And this bugged me for a long time. Why would the physical body have 3 separate delta frequencies for initiating homeostasis and a healing program? And we'll get into that. But you can see from this chart that I have not included that here in the delta. Technically, if I'm dividing beta into high, middle, and low, I should have delta as delta 1, 2, and 3, where delta 1 would be the deepest one, and delta 2 would be the next one up, and delta 3 would be the next one up. More superficial levels of healing and more deeper levels of healing for the deepest levels of primary survival systems in my body are being healed there, and the next up would be the next most primal associated with healing, with survival, and the next one up would be the most superficial ones that are most expendable but still need to be healed. But the concept that we can take all these different kind of brain frequencies and more that are soon to be discovered and worked with, and use brainwave entrainment to entrain your brain to any one of those and pick the lock of that program and make it run, and put you into an altered state of consciousness that is highly precise for your brain is a completely new concept. It's the first clinical use of brainwave entrainment technology, and particular binaural beats, to cause synchronicity of the hemispheres at the same time. And we have a patented method for creating binaural beats that is not like anybody else. Everyone else in the field uses two sine waves slightly out of tune with music on top of that to make it okay to listen to, because sine waves don't sound all that nice. So only the sine waves are doing the entrainment, and the rest is for making it pleasant to listen to. We untune the harmonics of the instrument sounds themselves, because they're all digital. We can go into the sounds themselves and manipulate the harmonics and untune the harmonics. So now that all the sounds that you hear are participating in the binaural beat entrainment, that the water and the bird chirps and the flute sounds and the cellos and the angel choirs and all the rest are all infused inside those sounds themselves with the binaural beat entrainment. Much more powerful way of doing things. So in the 21st century, we are bringing all this stuff together in a whole new format of how we align a clinical use of heart rate variability analysis of the core system in your body that tells all systems what to do, and balance it there, calculate all the brainwave frequency octaves that relate to that, and then entrain you to each one of those brain states separately in a systematic protocol for unlocking every single program and making it run and cleaning it out. Sort of a master program of attending to every aspect and facet of the brain and the body and the master control systems, and cleaning them and retuning them and going through the system methodically to make sure they're all clean. And in that process, people get better. And at some point, you're better. You're not a broken person trying to get fixed. You're a fixed person asking, now what? And what the answer to that is now what is the enviable state to be in all of human history. Now I'm standing at the doorstep of why I'm here and what am I all about and what am I supposed to be doing with my life. And the first stage of that is to maximize all my potentials, maximize my concentration and memory and creativity and flow state and IQ and all the rest of that with brain entrainment to specific brain frequencies that are unique to my brain and not generic. And the next step beyond that is out and out a new 21st century science of consciousness, of self-awareness, of expansion of consciousness, and of a new format of meditation that has never been seen before. And so let's take each one of these brainwaves apart. So this first one of beta, so we sort of discussed the three recognized divisions of beta: low beta, middle, and high beta. But beta is sort of a linear functioning of the brain that is focused on tasks and focused on goals and linear and methodical. And it's my regular state of consciousness in low to mid beta, the consciousness I'm most familiar with, that I identify with as a personality. Most of what we experience that way in our lives and in our jobs and in interactions with other people is somewhere between low and mid beta. When I get into super high focus states, say at my job, where I have a deadline and a lot of a complicated task that's going to take all my attention, my brain waves will go higher from mid to high beta in intense focus states. So The hallmark of beta is externally directed focused attention on a task or a goal. And in its ordinary sense, me interacting with the world in a cognitive, familiar fashion that I'm sort of associate reality with. However, alpha is peripheral vision. And as soon as you close your eyes, beta function collapses and alpha function begins, and a different waveform shows up. And it's a bigger difference than just 13 hertz is the borderline between beta up here and alpha down here. And you cross over that borderline, it's not just the difference between 13.1 and 12.9 as a speed, it's a different waveform shows up in alpha. But one of the functions of alpha is sort of the opposite yin-yang end of mental function. Alpha is still a mental state, whereas beta is a mental state. But alpha is peripheral vision instead of focused vision. So beta is focusing on a single task and completing that task, and alpha is a holographic function of peripheral vision. So even if I was just to look at you and not move my eyes but shift my attention to something on the wall with my peripheral vision, beta would collapse, alpha would expand. You can trick the brain because normally as soon as you close your eyes, alpha expands. So I can trick the brain into sitting in front of a blank wall and picking a spot on the wall and staring at that and not blinking and not moving my eyes. And the brain will treat that as if I just closed my eyes. Beta will collapse and alpha will expand. So that's sort of the meditation practice of candle flame meditation, or a spot on the wall meditation, or a mirror meditation where I look right here and I don't blink and don't move my eyes. Which brings me to another point of the fact that as time went on, I began to realize that each of these brain states has three components to it, three divisions of conscious experience with each brainwave. So, for instance, alpha has a sleep mode. All of them have a sleep mode, and so I call it sleeping, waking, and awakening, the three modes. So if I'm in my bed at night and the light is out and my eyes are closed and I'm in light sleep, slowly drifting, that's the sleep mode of alpha. And I will reach that certain exact frequency in alpha for me and pick the lock of a neural program and heal my mental faculties. But if I took, so let's say that some mid-range alpha at 10 hertz. The alpha range is 13 hertz at the borderline with beta, down to 7.5 or 8, 7 or 8 hertz down here. That's the range of alpha. So mid into alpha, say at 10 hertz alpha, let's teleport you out of your bed and put you in your workplace or in your ordinary life. And you're at exactly the same state of alpha at 10 hertz. But you're not asleep now. You're in an alpha zone in ordinary life, where you might be having a conversation with somebody and all of a sudden your mind starts to drift and you're noticing people around you and things around you. Say you're in a restaurant talking to somebody, all of a sudden you shift your focus and you're paying attention to somebody over here and some conversation over there and some noise behind you. And then all of a sudden you come back and you realize you just missed a little bit of the conversation you were having with someone. That's sort of an alpha state in a waking state. You didn't go to sleep there. Your brain went into holographic function. And then let's take that same person and teleport them into a meditation room where your butt is sitting on a pillow and your legs are crossed, and you're in an alpha state, 10 hertz. And that's a Zen meditation state. So in a Zen meditation state, I am aware that I am in the room and my butt's on the pillow and I'm smelling things and hearing things, and my eyes are in a stare or my eyes are closed and I'm feeling a breeze on my skin. But all of those sensations are a big mandala where nothing has any more importance than anything else. And I'm in this holographic mind function of peripheral consciousness. And that's a classic Zen meditation state associated with alpha. Each one of these states will have something similar to that: a sleep phase, an awaking phase, and an awakening phase. Theta is where we cross over the borderline into dreaming sleep. And in theta, there's REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement dreaming sleep, and there's non-REM sleep, where you're not dreaming, but you're in theta. Now, recent research has shown us that multiple research articles are now pointing to this non-REM sleep phase of theta sleep as having a significance all of its own, which has to do with memory consolidation and acceleration of learning. So part of the reason why studying something just before you go to bed is good, because when you get into non-REM sleep, your brain will take all that information you've been studying and coalesce it and categorize it and put it in its proper little places in order to pull that information together in your brain. That's non-REM sleep. REM sleep is the realm of dreaming, and that has different phases as well in REM sleep. One of the categories that happens in REM sleep is in your brainstem, there's a special zone called the reticular activating system, the RAS. And the RAS governs paralyzing your body from the neck down the moment that you go into REM sleep phase. The reasoning behind that is so that you don't act out your dreams and sleepwalk out into traffic and get killed or something. So your body is protecting you by paralyzing you from the neck down. The activating of the RAS. If you have significant injuries to your neck, particularly your upper neck, because the brainstem extends down the second cervical vertebra, and the RAS is in there. If you have a heavy whiplash injury or a concussion, which always has a whiplash associated with it, because if something hits your head hard enough to rattle your brain, it's certainly whacking your head around and causing whiplash. It's possible to traumatize the RAS. So it's no longer in complete synchronicity with REM sleep phase. And so the most extreme example of that would be that the moment that I cross over into REM sleep phase, when the door should be closing in the RAS to paralyze my body from the neck down as the dreams begin, that's a synchronized event, that the RAS closes the door just as I begin the dreaming process so that nothing bad happens. If that's out of sync, which it is for a lot of people, then you'll get that jerk thing that happens to you when you first start to get into a dream phase, and your brain will incorporate that into your dream, and usually you'll trip over a log or step back and trip over something, or you'll fall. It's usually a falling thing that your brain immediately snaps into and makes an image out of the fact that stray discharges are still that are able to come out from that dream because the door of the RAS hasn't completely closed. Some discharge can get out into your body and make your body jerk, and incorporate that into the dream. It seems like you're falling and you do something, but you actually do something in bed. You jerk. The different phases of REM sleep in upper theta is sort of sweeping the cobwebs of the day's meaningless stuff out the window and throwing it in the garbage bin because you don't need that information. It's not important information, so it gets swept away. Deeper level of that house cleaning business is mid theta, and deep theta is the deep dream material, deepest in the unconscious mind, populated by dream imagery of metaphorical and allegorical images, where you're in deep theta dream phase, where all kinds of fantastical things happen, where it's your universe and you make the rules, where you can fly and walk through walls and do all kinds of strange things that you wouldn't ordinarily associate it with reality. But somehow in the dream phase, you just take it for granted that, yeah, of course I can fly, and yes, I can walk through walls. Someplace in that zone is where the possibility of connecting to higher or deeper levels of information in the deepest part of the collective unconscious mind, which gives you answers to things, or true new ideas can drop into your mind, and that incorporates into your dream. So the dream you're having is about something that you start to realize, wait a second, this is an actual new idea, and it becomes so powerful that it wakes you up, and you're looking for a pad to write something down on because you just got a chunk of unique, new, say, patentable ideas, right? Einstein, famous for that, in a dream. He dreamed what it would be like to be riding on a sunbeam at the speed of light, which became E equals mc squared, his most famous formula of all time, and formed the pattern of special relativity and all that kind of stuff. So that's the kind of way that my brain works. I have a pad of paper next to me, and some of those dreams are, 3D Technicolor, mind-blowing dream, wakes you up, you go, oh my God, that's not a dream, that's information, where's my pad? Delta sleep, like I said, is the deepest stage of sleep, where you're most profoundly asleep and out cold completely, most difficult to wake up. And I dwelled in my mind a great deal trying to figure out why the math showed 3 octaves of delta brain activity, 3 specific frequencies in delta, in which entrainment, any of those would cause homeostasis in the autonomic nervous system and turn on a healing program. So therefore you've got 3 different healing programs for the physical body in delta. And what would those 3 programs be working on? And the answer to that question is in sleep research and itself, and in neurophysiological textbooks where it discusses dream phasing, not dream phasing, a sleep phase. So let's pick it apart. And I use this clinically. So one of the things is in the biotuning process, when we find this frequency and calculate these brain frequencies for you, the very first session we ever do is in the deepest stage of delta that we identify, because people under stress all the time, running a fight or flight response all the time, are denying themselves the deepest phase of sleep in delta, because that's when I'm most vulnerable and I'm running a vigilance program because I think my life is threatened. So I won't let myself go there. And I need that desperately, because if homeostasis is disengaged with the sympathetic on all the time, I can't heal. Homeostasis is a prerequisite for healing, and all my systems are drifting and I'm getting more and more symptoms. So I desperately need some physical recuperation in the deepest stage of sleep, but that's the very one that I'm denying myself because I'm running a vigilance program. So that's why I began in the deepest stage of sleep right away to recuperate that function. So at least every night we're getting that function back. So the deepest stage of sleep, sorry, let me go back here, is the deepest, remember, in deep sleep is the lowest heart rate, respiration, body temperature, lowest metabolic processes in your cells. So obviously, the areas in the hypothalamus and the autonomic nervous system itself are being worked on and retuned for the next day, which governs body temperature and water balance and deep survival things like that, respiration, cardiac function, urinary function, right? So it's lowest heart rate, lowest blood pressure, lowest respiration. So obviously respiration is being worked on, lowest heart rate, lowest blood pressure, cardiac systems are being worked on, lowest body temperature, temperature systems in the brainstem are being worked on. All these deep vegetative functions of the deepest levels of that we have to have for survival, right? Working on the organelles of the autonomic nervous system themselves, the pituitary, the pineal gland, those things, the master control centers are being worked on and retuned for the next day. Lowest cellular processes, so the cells are in their most quiescent, lowest metabolic state, so they can rest. And the systems inside the cell can rest. The nucleus, the mitochondria, that means that the mitochondria is being reset, the energy powerhouse of the cell, that the DNA and the telomeres and all of that are being reset and retuned and rebalanced for the next day. This level is what's being worked on every night in the deepest delta phase that we call delta 1. Delta 2 is the next one up from that, an octave higher than that. And that would be working on organs and glands. So here's all the organs and here's the glands. And the control centers for those, which is pituitary for the glands and autonomic for the organs. It also would be governing body chemistry and chi energy and meridian balance and chakras, and all of these kind of systems are delta 2. Not as critical as the deepest vegetative functions for survival, but necessary for survival. You got to have organs and glands and biochemistry. But if your autonomic nervous system turned off, you would be dead, right? If your brain just turned off, you would be dead. But if your lungs turned off, you could survive for about 3 minutes. If you get a gut injury, you can survive for 24 hours. You can live without your gallbladder. You can live without your spleen. You can receive significant injury to the liver and still be alive. Delta 3, the most superficial, up at the top layer of delta, is working on muscles and bones and joints and skin and things like that. The third level up of survivability. You can survive without an arm or a leg, but these things still need to be repaired, and that's what the delta 3 at the top of delta is all about. And once again, in biotuning, we're going to run all those programs, all 3 of those. I'm going to make them run, clean the system out. So delta goes down to 0.5 hertz. So somewhere around 4 hertz to 0.5 hertz. 0.5 hertz is one brain pulse every 2 seconds. 1 hertz, one brain pulse every second. 0.5 hertz, one brain pulse every 2 seconds. That's the lowest delta bracket that is recognized in EEG literature. And it was brain frequency below that I discovered in 1989. Frequencies below 0.5 hertz. In other words, brain frequency activity, one brain pulse every 4 seconds, right? So epsilon, I call that epsilon, is one brain pulse every 2 to 4 seconds. That's epsilon 1, and epsilon 2 is one brain pulse every 4 to 8 seconds. And whenever I saw this brain pattern showing up on the EEG with patients, they always would get off the table with some amazing story, out-of-the-body experience, flying, seeing, floating by the ceiling and looking down on me with my computer and seeing their body down there, flying out through the ceiling and going places. Later, people would come back and say they were having precognitive experiences during the week. They knew that the phone was going to ring and who it was going to be, things like that. I classified the epsilon experience as ecstatic states or metaphysical. It's a metaphysical state of consciousness. It's also where people got in contact or in touch with sort of the esoteric meaning behind their physical symptoms. I sort of refer to that as the Louise Hay's zone, where that little book that made her famous was the metaphor of all the symptoms you could have in any part of your body. For instance, and I saw this operating all the time in my practice for 40 years. It was sort of a joke. A person comes in with a chronic shoulder pain and nobody seems to be able to fix it. Then the question is, you're shouldering too much responsibility. So what has happened recently at about the same time the shoulder started? And it says, well, I mean, yeah, it was when the mother-in-law moved in with us. Or some kind of new thing has happened that is more responsibility you have to shoulder than you had before, and you're finding it difficult to do so. Louise Hay's favorite was chronic constipation, sitting on old shit that you're not willing to get rid of. And when I was on the faculty of California Institute for Human Science, one of my students took this on to see if we could increase precognitive ability by using epsilon brainwave entrainment. And so he had a whole thing that he did, because he had to write a research report and a paper for school. So Group A Group A believed that they had precognitive ability because they've had some kind of experiences in the past. Group B did not believe they had personal abilities because they'd never had any. Group C was a control group. Everybody took a computerized test from Duke University based on the Zenar card test, which is 5 oversized cards with primary symbols, circle, square, wavy lines, things like that. You're supposed to shuffle the deck and use your psychic ability to figure out what card is going to pop up at the top of the deck after it's shuffled. Well, the computer is doing that because the computer can do a true random shuffle and people can't. So you would sit there and you've got the 5 cards, you've got a shuffle thing going, and when you decide which card you think is going to come up on top and you click it, the shuffle stops and pops up a card and it scores you against chance, and you do 100 of those. And so everybody did that test before and then listened to a 17-minute track of this epsilon entrainment, and then did another 100 trials with this computer program again. And the result was Group A, who believed they had precognitive ability, had their ability to correctly predict which card was going to come up boosted by 373%, which is so far beyond statistics you don't even have to write it down. But the mystery was group B did minus 200% bad, which is an impossible level of bad. You couldn't possibly do that bad unless you psychically knew which card was going to come up and chose not to choose it in order to prove a point that you don't have the ability, you know. And we sort of came away from that realizing that we weren't really so much testing precognitive ability as testing people's belief systems. The people who believed they had the ability, the Epsilon entrainment boosted their belief and their ability expanded by 373%. And group B, who didn't believe that they had the ability, contracted, actually didn't, tricked them into using the ability they had to not choose the card that they knew was going to be coming up at a subconscious level. Very powerful, amazing sort of stuff that needs to be more, to have more research, a major study. That's Epsilon. Out of the body, in another realm, access to deep metaphysical information and experiences, spiritual insights, epiphanies of a grand nature. All were part of the Epsilon experience. And by the way, I produced a soundtrack. That soundtrack that we used to boost that ability in that project, I produced that as a soundtrack called Psi Boost, PSI Boost. It's on my website. There are a series of articles that came through my news feeds where they did a big study of prodigy kids with super high IQs above 180. Einstein was 160. So these kids who are graduating from Harvard when they're 12 with a PhD, you know, they did this massive study of these kids with EEG to see what's going on in their brains. And what did they find? Maximum activity in all these kids' brains at the borderline between beta and alpha. So now all of a sudden, the concept of borderline states is proven in research projects. Now, I have been using borderline states since 1988. The borderline state at the opposite end between theta and delta is where long-term memory happens, and I use that on myself in order to pass the California board exams and turn that into a business in training professionals' brainwaves to help them study for their board and bar exams and medical license exams and veterinary exams. I'd have all these professionals coming to me who are freaked out because they had to take the toughest exam in the country, the California board exam or bar exam. So I already was familiar with the borderline state, but to see it acknowledged in a scientific study of high IQ prodigy kids as another borderline state solidified my idea that, wow, borderline states might be a thing. That now I see a pattern showing up. I'm working with this one, and here these guys are showing this one. I wonder about the other ones. You know, what are the other ones? All of a sudden I began to look for evidence of borderline states and specific states of consciousness to go with them. So that means that if we use brainwave entrainment to the beta alpha borderline state, particularly for you, that we derive from the HRV trace, that we should theoretically be able to boost your IQ, which means boosts the axon connections between neurons in your brain, which is what Einstein's brain is. And from a previous slide in this broadcast, we showed that IQ is directly related to more axon connections between brain cells. So that means that these high IQ prodigy kids had a few things going on for them. Number one, their brains are denser and more connectivity, like Einstein's brain. And we have a synchronicity between the right-left hemispheres that is more accentuated than a normal person. So if we use binaural beats set to beta alpha, to the borderline, and we use headphones, we get synchronicity of the hemispheres at the same time, and we've set the brain up to the exact place that we see with high IQ. And if we train that up in the gym every day, there's no reason to assume that we shouldn't be able to do that, shouldn't be able to train that function. And that lended me to really start delving into the borderline states in general. And so realizing that the borderline between alpha and theta is where the flow state is. And my news feeds have, again, shown PubMed research reports linking the borderline between alpha and theta as the flow state. That these borderline states that we used to just cross over without noticing from one brain state to the other, when we look at them carefully and expand them out, there's a whole brain state of its own. It's a whole state of consciousness, and something happens there that is different than any other brain state. Not only is that where the flow state is, at the borderline between alpha and theta, but that's also where the Schumann resonance is, because the borderline between alpha and theta is somewhere between 7 and 8 hertz. And the Schumann resonance is 7.83 hertz, right in that range. And the research reports for the flow state are the borderline between alpha and theta was somewhere around 7.5 hertz. The flow state and the Schumann resonance are very close together. They are different, but they're very close together. So these two states, the flow and the Schumann resonance, these are the alpha theta borderline state. And these are both soundtracks that I made for that purpose, alpha theta and the Schumann resonance. Then there's the theta delta borderline state that I just mentioned. It's where long-term memory is accessed. It's also the realm of where, remember, theta is emotions and delta is physical in sleep research, that this is where you can clear the physical symptoms that are coming from my emotional traumas. In other words, my emotional traumas are playing themselves out as physical symptoms. But the primary way that I've ever used this is to access long-term memory for a new sort of 21st century way of learning, where you don't have to filter the information you're trying to learn through a linear system of memorizing by repetition in order to get some of it to drop down. You know, only 20% of it drops down, 80% evaporates away. You don't remember any of it in 6 months. But this way, if you have a brainwave entrainment soundtrack going in the background that holds the door open to your long-term memory while you study something, all of it goes directly into the unconscious mind. Accelerated learning. The delta epsilon borderline state. That's where I stand at the threshold between the Newtonian physical universe that I'm familiar with and the metaphysical universe, the quantum universe, where the laws and the rules seem to be very different. So this is where I get the metaphysical understanding of my physical symptoms, the Louise Hay zone. where my chronic shoulder pain is shouldering too much responsibility as part of that picture. Then we have something called SMR beta. So aside from the fact that we've got, low and mid and high beta, stuck in there is a special bandwidth of beta called SMR beta, sensory motor beta, where the sensory cortex and the motor cortex, sensory cortex receives all the signals coming from my body and processes it there. And the motor cortex, which is the band of noodles just in front of that, is the motor cortex, which will take that information and send signals back down into my body to make things happen. So if I want to move my arm, then it's the motor cortex that sends signals down the spinal cord out that series of nerve roots to make those muscles contract to make my puppet body do its thing, coming from the motor cortex. The interesting thing about the motor cortex is the motor cortex in the 6 layers of cells, of brain cells, has specialized cells down on the, I think it's the 3rd layer, which are special cells that only show up in the motor cortex. They're called the giant pyramidal cells of Betz because they're shaped like pyramids. And that is where the impetus arises from those pyramidal cells to send signals out into the body to make the puppet move. All comes from that 3rd or 4th layer of pyramid cells in the motor cortex. But this SMR beta is where the sensory and the motor cortex balance themselves out, like the heart rate variability shows with sympathetic and parasympathetic, where sensory and motor cortex go into this balance place, sort of a Zen balance place. And it's possible to be in a meditative state while you move. Now, some traditions call this karma yoga. You do things like work in the garden or sweep the leaves or do the dishes while you stay in this meditative state where your brainwaves go into this SMR beta state, which is eyes open, but sort of an alpha function. It's an interesting state. It's a different waveform that shows up in beta, so its bandwidth is unique. SMR beta also tends to be something that is severely deficient in ADD and ADHD and dyslexia, and in some cases autism. And so SMR brain training is part of a program for ADD and ADHD and dyslexia and autism. It's part of the program that I would do with neurological developmental problem kids. I mean, that was a big part of my practice, was kids with those kind of problems and women with menstrual and pregnancy and miscarriage problems. But I was a real expert in neurological developmental problems, ADD, ADHD, dyslexia, autism, epilepsy, things like that. And all of those had substrate issues that were the same across the board of all of them. All of them had these various brain frequency deficiency, default mode network, SMR beta, in autism, a mu brain frequency, which I'll discuss. Entrainment to those was part of the fix of treating the underlying conditions that those are spinning from without making a claim of treating autism. You're not treating autism, you're treating a brain deficiency that autism is part of, but so are a whole bunch of other different kinds of conditions. Same with PTSD. So this would be every minute Zen. This would be meditation in action, karma yoga, Gurdjieff's work on yourself, where you bring the meditation into your ordinary life, which I think is of supreme importance. If you don't bring meditation, if your life doesn't become your meditation, then your spiritual aspect of your life is stuck in a meditation room for an hour an evening or something. Mu is a specific type of waveform that shows up that is technically in the alpha range, but is a completely different type of waveform that shows up in the alpha range. So it's not alpha, it's mu. And mu is called the mirror neurons. It's how young children learn socialization skills. The area in the brain, the sensory cortex in the brain that is receiving signals from all my senses. So let's say my eyes. I'm watching my parent figures in my life, and I'm learning from them. I'm learning speech, I'm learning language, I'm learning tone of voice, I'm learning facial expression, I'm learning body language. I'm learning what these things mean as the sensory cortex, the areas in the sensory cortex light up as mirror neurons of what I see this person's body doing. So when this person smiles, all the smile information in the sensory cortex also lights up, but it doesn't spill over into the motor cortex and make me smile to mirror that. It stays contained in the sensory cortex as what's called mirror neuron activity. So it's sort of in a way like the RAS turning on so I don't act out my dreams. It's the sensory cortex is receiving signals and mirroring those signals and having the neurons light up and do the same dance as I see what another person is doing. And this burns pathways of understanding what tone of voice and facial expression and body language mean. In autistic kids, the higher up the spectrum you get, the more deficient mu is and the less socialization skills you have, until when it's really severe, there is no recognition of what facial expressions or body language means or tone of voice means. It's completely over your head. That's why they don't look at you in the eyes, because you're not even seen as something. You're sort of part of the landscape. You're not something to pay attention to any more than a light switch on the wall. But these are functional deficiencies, and they can be retrained. So mu training is part of the program for, in particular, autism. It's the one condition that mu is deficient in. However, our more recent research in the last year has shown that mu function is also part of, in adults, what we associate with empathy. It means that if my mu function is strong as an adult, then I am more empathic, because this mirror function means that I really see from another person's standpoint, and that has an effect on me. So that means that we're pulling mu out of the autism children's category that has been in for my whole practice of 40 years, and we're pulling it out of that category and putting it in a completely different category of entrainment in its own right for boosting empathy. Now, there's another category of empathy, and that's gamma, and that we saw from the Dalai Lama with his research with the monks, that they were having, massive amplitudes of gamma penetrating through their skulls. And when they were questioned what they experienced an empathic bonding with all life in the universe. So there's an empathy aspect to the spiritual use of gamma as a meditation form. The default mode network, the most enigmatic, advanced findings in neuroscience since 2001. It's still being researched. There's so many aspects of the default mode network. It's I could do a whole thing on it, but default mode network was discovered in 2001 using fMRI, and they discovered a brainwave frequency that was the slowest brain frequency anyone had ever seen. One brain pulse every 10 to 20 seconds. Now, when I was discovering Epsilon, which blew my mind because that was the slowest at that point that anybody had ever seen, at one brain pulse every 2 to 4 seconds, and Epsilon 2 every 4 to 8 seconds, I was already contemplating, I wonder if there's something like an Epsilon 3 or something below that, when I discovered that gamma had been discovered and got distracted with gamma and hypergamma and lambda. But then when they discovered the default mode network, it would have been where Epsilon 3 would have gone, right? Because Epsilon 1 is every 2 to 4 seconds, Epsilon 2 is every 4 to 8 seconds, and this is 10 to 20 seconds, so it's all very close. Default mode network is 4 zones in the brain: a frontal zone, a occipital zone in the back, and 2 side zones in the temporal parietal area. And these 4 zones are all tightly synchronized together in their function at this super slow brain frequency pulse, where these 4 zones are hyper synchronized together doing this pulse. First of all, they describe this as associated with the binding. I'm sorry, that's gamma. The sense of self, because this frontal zone is my sense of self inside my skin. The posterior zone is my sense of self outside my skin. You synchronize those two together, and I get my normal sense of self in space. These two are my sense of time, all my past events up to the present, anticipating off into the future. Synchronize those two, I get my normal sense of the present. So this is me in time and space. That's where that is processed. If the 4 zones start to become unsynchronized, we'll think about that. What that means. I mean, if my sense of self in time and space comes when they're normally synchronized, so they start to become unsynchronized, that's sort of like dissociative disorders, schizophrenia disorders, and things like that. Then it turns out that research report after report after report started going through my news feeds for years, that now we know that desynchronizing of the 4 zones is associated with every neurological condition you've ever heard of. ADD, ADHD, dyslexia, depression, autism, epilepsy, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, PTSD, all of those have a desynchronizing of the 4 zones as part of their picture. So if any of those came through my door, default mode network entrainment would be absolutely what we have to do. And I realized that I had a unique approach to dealing with desynchronizing of the 4 zones that nobody else had, which is a clinical use of binaural beats that cause synchronicity, right? So if these are desynchronized and I put headphones on and I set the entrainment to default mode with headphones, I'm resynchronizing. And then if I take a second set of binaural beats and rotate them in 3-dimensional space and line them up to these two, now I've got it. And so that has been a treatment plan I've been using since 2001 for default mode, and I have a whole protocol for PTSD and for combat stress and things like that, and depression and ADD and ADHD and all these different conditions that have that as an underlying substrate. Gamma. Well, we've already talked about the Dalai Lama's research with gamma. that it's associated with long-term meditators and associated with perhaps an access to extra physical body energy fields in the universe that the brain can use to create any amplitude of gamma that it requires to penetrate the skull. It's also associated with universal empathy for all living things. So there's an empathy aspect to gamma. Gamma is also odd that, well, first of all, let's show this. Here's the Dalai Lama with these monks during this project. So here's these brain mapping computers that were picking up gamma with a regular EEG where it couldn't before. fMRI studies the brain of these meditators. This was heart rate variability and cardiac function and respiration. Amazing stuff. Gamma was discovered in the late 80s with open brain surgery with electrodes directly on the brain. The EEG electrodes were right on the brain. So now all of a sudden it could pick up these exotic frequencies of 40, 100, and 200 hertz activity that couldn't penetrate the skull before because the electrodes are right on the cortex. So in the beginning, gamma was thought to be was called the associated with cognitive consciousness because gamma was the only brain frequency that disappears under general anesthesia. Then it was called the binding frequency because it was determined that gamma function binds all the sensory information from various areas of the cortex, seeing, hearing, smelling, things like that, all into one place and bound them together so that my experience out here in the world makes sense because it's synchronized up in my brain. And so therefore, problems with gamma function would have fracturing of my sensory coordination in the world, and things would start to get weird. And that's precisely what you see in high level of autism. Now, that's coming from me. That's not in the general literature. That's what I saw and discovered in my practice with autistic kids, that gamma is obviously involved because the symptom picture is exactly what you would see if you had desynchronizing of gamma binding. It also turns out in later research that the binding happens where gamma brain function at 40 hertz combines with theta function at around 5 hertz and modulates those two together. And that's exactly how FM radio works. In other words, frequency modulation is FM. FM radio uses frequency modulation where you have a sound wave and a carrier wave and a modulation wave working together, and it lifts it out into the atmosphere so you can pick it up on your radio. And that means that gamma function modulates gamma with theta together and lifts the information right out of the cortex into a wireless network in the brain. An intranet of the brain is where the binding is taking place, wireless communication in the brain. Now, there's no reason to believe that it stops there. Once it's wireless, it could communicate to any cell in the body or to any other person. So that is still sort of out there to be researched. Then there's 100 hertz activity, hypergamma, as you know, an extreme level of focus that goes beyond anything that you're normally associating with the word focus into sort of a universal focus of all things. Spiritual peripheral vision, so to speak. And beyond that, in lambda, 200 hertz brain activity, where sort of all bets are off. Nobody's researching that stuff except for me. The concept that the proof in gamma with the Dalai Lama's research that you could have amplitudes of gamma that are far beyond what we know of how the brain works and how the brain has access to enough power. This brain doesn't have access to enough power to increase the amplitude of a super low amplitude brain frequency by definition. The only way that could happen is to open a doorway to the universe and grab energy from there to amplify it to whatever you want. So it means that gamma, that the lambda 200 hertz and above, they've discovered 500 hertz. I saw an article of 2500 hertz. I don't even know what that means. It's connection with the universe at a level that is so far indefinable that those realms of consciousness are something to be achieved or to work towards. But lambda and hypergamma, particularly lambda, may be such a level of open access to universal energy forces that could be the explanation for monks melting the snow around them in the Himalayan mountains with just a robe on. So, and then the research reports are always kind of coming through. Brainwaves synchronize when people interact. We already know that. That's a couple oscillators phenomenon. Brainwaves synchronize, heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, all synchronize, particularly if you make contact with another person and hold their hands. Brain synchrony, right? Separate social environments, brain waves are just separate from each other. But when people interact, you can see that the blue and the green are synchronizing up together. This person over here that's not part of this is separate, but they're still kind of following. They're still sort of drawn in. They're not completely synchronized, but they're still under the influence of two people synchronized, starts to bring this one into the fold. If you expand this idea into groups of people intentionally connecting together to synchronize, then you've got what we're doing here. Global mind link with brainwave entrainment through headphones to synchronize everybody's brainwaves to exactly the same state and synchronize up their hemispheres at the same time to open doorways to higher levels of information and influence into the universe. And that's what we're up to. So with that being said, here's our headphones. Today, the title of this is The Flow. So we're doing this 7.5 hertz brain entrainment, the flow state together. And just begin this out to visualize what we're here for. We're here to change something in the world. We're here to modulate a function in the quantum field to push the envelope of a world that is more towards a perfect idea of how the world could be if we all wanted to decide it to be that way. So have that picture in your mind of what kind of a world would it be? A world of empathy where we care for each other and that we use our best effort for each other, that people before money kind of an idea. Peace, not war. Love, not hate. That's where we're going with this. Flow together, in the flow state together. Thank you all for being here. I apologize for having this be such a long broadcast, but I sort of knew this was going to be the case because getting through 22 brain states with any kind of information was going to push the envelope of how much time this was going to take. But thank you for writing it out with me. I'm going to leave the chat open for another 30 minutes or so, and then we'll can shift over to the Discord channel. Thank you all. Thank you all very much, and I'll see you next Sunday.